Imagine waking up in a city that has existed for 200 years, in a kingdom that has existed for longer than anyone's grandparents can remember, and going to sleep that same night in a place that no longer has a name. Not destroyed, not erased from the map, simply absorbed, swallowed, written over, until the word you used yesterday to describe your home no longer means anything to the soldiers now walking through your gate. This is not a single story. It is 6 of them, separated by months and sometimes years, but connected by the same terrifying arithmetic, because in the final decade of the Warring States period, one kingdom fell roughly every 2 years, and nobody inside those kingdoms knew, on any ordinary morning, that they were living through the last days of their own world. For more than 2 centuries, 7 kingdoms had divided the lands that would one day be called China. Qin in the west, Han, Zhao, and Wei pressed together in the center. Yan to the northeast, guarding the cold frontier near the steppe. Chu sprawling across the south along the Yangtze. And Qi, proud and wealthy, facing the eastern sea. People grew up inside these borders the way people grow up inside a language. A child born in the Zhao capital of Handan did not think of themselves as a temporary resident of a temporary state. They thought of themselves simply as someone from Zhao, the way a person today might think of themselves as simply from where they are from, without imagining the possibility that the entire category could vanish. This is what makes the last days of these 6 kingdoms so strange to look back on. The people who lived through them were not extras in a war film, watching armies clash on a horizon. They were shopkeepers reopening their stalls one more morning, farmers walking out to fields they assumed would still belong to their family next spring, officials filing routine tax records in archives that would be ash or imperial property within the year. Most people never imagine the end of a civilization as something that arrives in the middle of an unremarkable Tuesday. But that is almost exactly how it happened. 6 separate times, across 6 separate kingdoms, in barely a single decade. In this video, we are stepping into the final weeks and months of each of those 6 kingdoms. Not from the perspective of the generals who get remembered in the history books, but from the ground, from inside the gates, from the rooms where families argued about whether to flee or stay, where officials burned documents they no longer wanted Qin hands to read, and where ordinary people watched the unthinkable arrive at their own doorstep. Every place named here is real. Every event is documented in the Chinese historical record, and the order in which these kingdoms fell is one of the most precisely dated sequences in all of ancient history. What is rarely discussed is what each ending actually felt like while it was happening. The first kingdom to disappear did so almost silently. Han had spent generations as the weakest of the 7, squeezed on every side by larger neighbors, its territory shrinking decade after decade until what remained was a narrow strip of land around its capital at Zheng, the city known today as Xinjiang in Henan province. By 230 before the Common Era, Han's king, known to history as King An, governed a state that existed mostly on paper when the Qin general known as Neishi Teng marched south across the Yellow River. There was no Changping, no flooded city, no desperate last stand remembered in song. Han's capital fell within the same year the campaign began. To the people living inside Zheng, the change arrived less like a catastrophe and more like a long-expected verdict finally being read aloud. Officials who had spent their careers serving Han now found their land reorganized into something called Yingchuan Commandery, a Qin administrative unit with a new governor, new tax registers, and a new legal code replacing the laws their grandfathers had lived under. The strange cruelty of being first is that nobody remembers being first. Han's ending barely registers in popular memory of this period, and yet for the families inside Zheng, it was the only ending that mattered. The moment their entire civic identity was quietly filed away into a paperwork category. A year later, loyalists in the old Han territory rose in rebellion against their new rulers. It failed, and King An, who had been allowed to live after his surrender, was executed once the uprising was crushed. Even surviving the fall of your kingdom, it turned out, bought only a little time. Zhao did not go quietly. Zhao's people had already endured the single most traumatic military disaster of the entire Warring States period a generation earlier, in 260 before the Common Era, when a Qin army under the general Bai Qi defeated a massive Zhao force at Changping and, according to the historical record, ordered the mass execution of the surrendered soldiers. The psychological wound from that single event never fully closed. Families in Handan, Zhao's capital, grew up with the knowledge that Qin was not merely a rival state, but something closer to an existential threat, an enemy willing to do what other kingdoms considered unthinkable. So, when Qin armies finally moved against Zhao in earnest in the final years before unification, the people of Handan were not naive about what defeat might mean. What makes Zhao's final years so difficult to read about is the sheer accumulation of misfortune layered on top of military pressure. In the years immediately before the end, the region around Zhao's northern territory was struck by an earthquake near Dai County. And not long after, a severe drought brought famine to a kingdom that desperately needed every able body for its defense. This part is rarely discussed in popular retellings. But Zhao's final defenders were not simply outmatched soldiers. They were hungry people, weakened by natural disaster, attempting to hold a capital against the most efficient war machine of the ancient world. Zhao's general Li Mu had, remarkably, defeated Qin forces in the field more than once, earning him the title Lord of Wuan and giving his people genuine reason to hope. But Qin spies bribed a trusted Zhao minister to convince the king that Li Mu was secretly plotting against the throne. The king believed it. Li Mu was removed from command and, according to multiple historical accounts, was killed on the king's own order, just as Qin forces closed in on Handan. The defenders who had once turned back Qin armies in open battle were now leaderless at the exact moment they needed leadership most. Handan fell. King Qian of Zhao surrendered. His older half-brother, known as Prince Jia, fled north with a remnant of loyalists and tried to keep a fragment of Zhao alive under the name Dai. For a few more years in the borderlands near Hebei and Shaanxi, a kingdom inside a kingdom, a shadow government clinging to the edge of the map until it, too, was extinguished. To the ordinary residents of Handan, the famine had already taken the harvest. The earthquake had already taken the roofs over their heads, and the execution of their own celebrated general had taken whatever was left of their confidence, long before a single Qin soldier reached the city wall. Wei's ending is, in some ways, the most haunting of all six, because the method used to end it had nothing to do with the bravery or cowardice of any soldier. Wei's capital, Daliang, sat at the confluence of two rivers near a canal called the Hong, in the location of what is now the city of Kaifeng in Henan province, and its defenders had genuine reason for confidence. The city's natural position gave it real protection, with a wide moat and gated drawbridges that made a direct assault extraordinarily costly. The Qin general assigned to take it, Wang Ben, tried direct methods first and found them slow and bloody, so he made a decision that still unsettles people who learn about it for the first time. Rather than storming the walls, Qin engineers spent more than 3 months redirecting the waters of the Yellow River itself, along with the Hong Canal, into the city of Daliang. This was not a metaphor or an exaggeration in later retelling. It was an engineering project on the scale of a small war in itself, undertaken specifically to drown a city into submission. When the waters finally broke through, the destruction inside Daliang was catastrophic. Historical estimates suggest more than 100,000 people died in the flooding, a number that includes ordinary residents who had nothing to do with the military defense of the city. People whose only crime was living inside walls that Qin had decided to turn into a basin. King Jia of Wei surrendered amid the wreckage and was later executed. To the people living through it, there was no battle to fight, no wall to defend, no enemy soldier to face down with whatever courage they could summon. There was only water, rising through streets and homes and markets, an enemy that could not be negotiated with or fought, only escaped or not escaped. Few moments in this entire era capture so starkly what it meant to be an ordinary person caught inside someone else's war. Wei's ending was decided not by who fought hardest, but by who controlled the river. Yan's final years contain the single most famous individual act of resistance in this entire period, and it is worth sitting inside it for a moment, because it shows what desperation looked like when a kingdom realized it could not win through conventional means. By 227 before the Common Era, Yan's rulers understood that Qin's advance, having already swallowed Han and Zhao, would not stop at their southern border. Crown Prince Dan of Yan, who had once been held as a diplomatic hostage in the Qin court and had personally witnessed the king of Qin up close, decided that assassination was the kingdom's last realistic option. He recruited a swordsman named Jing Ke, a man originally from the small state of Wei who had fled to Yan after his homeland was absorbed by Qin years earlier. The plan that emerged was elaborate and, in hindsight, almost unbearably tragic in its design. A Qin general who had fallen out of favor and defected to Yan agreed to take his own life so that his severed head could be presented to the king of Qin as a gift, a gesture intended to prove the sincerity of Yan's surrender delegation and earn Jing Ke an audience close enough to strike. Before departing for the Qin capital at Xianyang, Jing Ke was given a poisoned dagger, hidden inside a map scroll that supposedly showed a fertile region of Yan being offered as tribute. At the Yi River, on the border between the two states, Crown Prince Dan and a small group of mourners dressed in white, the color of funerals, to send Jing Ke off, because everyone involved seemed to understand he was unlikely to return. Accounts describe Jing Ke singing a farewell verse about the cold wind over the river before he departed west toward a king he intended to kill. Inside the Qin palace, the plan unraveled at the final moment. Jing Ke's companion froze with fear at the threshold and was barred from approaching further. Jing Ke alone walked forward to present the map. When he unrolled it and the hidden dagger was exposed, he lunged at the king, tore his sleeve, and chased him around a ceremonial pillar, while the king struggled to draw his own oversized ceremonial sword, fumbling with its length until palace guards and a quick-thinking physician intervened. Jing Ke was killed where he stood. The assassination had failed by a matter of seconds and a few centimeters of torn silk. They had no idea that this failure would not slow Qin down at all. If anything, the attempt gave Qin's king every justification he needed to accelerate the invasion he had already been planning. Qin forces crushed Yan's army and its allies the following year, captured the Yan capital at Ji, near the location of modern Beijing, and forced King Shi to flee with the remnants of his court to the Liaodong Peninsula in the far northeast, clinging to a sliver of territory for a few more years before that, too, was taken. Chu's ending unfolded differently from all the others, not in a single dramatic moment, but across a long and exhausting campaign that revealed just how much resistance was still possible when a kingdom was determined and its territory was vast enough to make conquest difficult. Chu stretched across the Yangtze River basin into the deep south, a kingdom so large and so culturally distinct from the northern states that some historians still describe it as almost a civilization of its own, with its own poetry, its own religious traditions, and its own dialect of governance. When Qin's young general Li Xin confidently predicted that 200,000 troops would be enough to conquer Chu, the veteran general Wang Zhan disagreed, insisting the real number needed to be closer to 600,000. The king of Qin sided with the younger general's optimism. It was a costly mistake. Chu's general Zhang Yan ambushed Li Xin's overconfident force deep in unfamiliar territory near what is now the border region of Jiangsu and Anhui provinces, inflicting a defeat so severe that Li Xin was removed from frontline command for years. Qin's king was forced to swallow his pride, recall Wang Jian, and grant him the full 600,000 troops he had originally requested. What followed was not a swift campaign, but a grinding war of attrition. Wang Jian, according to the historical record, deliberately avoided major engagements for an extended period, allowing Chu's massive but exhausted garrisons to gradually disband and demobilize out of sheer frustration at the lack of action, before finally striking with overwhelming and decisive force. Chu's capital by this point had already been forced to relocate more than once over previous decades, eventually settling at Shuchun in what is now Anhui province, a sign in itself of how much territory the kingdom had already surrendered before the final blow ever landed. When Wang Zhen's army finally overran the diminished Chu defenses, the kingdom's last leader died in the fighting, with different ancient sources disagreeing on whether it was General Xiang Yan who fell in battle or took his own life rather than surrender. To the people of the south, Chu's end did not arrive as a single shocking morning. It arrived as a slow erosion, capital after capital abandoned, territory after territory ceded, until the place they called home had shrunk so far that its final collapse felt less like a surprise and more like an inevitability they had been bracing for across an entire generation. And then there was Qi, the last kingdom standing, the wealthy eastern state that had once been home to the Jixia Academy, a gathering place for scholars and philosophers so renowned that it had drawn brilliant minds from across the warring world for nearly a century and a half. Qi's people had genuine reason to believe their kingdom might survive where the others had not. They were geographically distant from Qin, protected by mountains and rivers and other kingdoms standing between them and the conqueror's army. But this is where everything changed. And it changed not through battle, but through a betrayal so quiet it left almost no blood on the historical record at all. Qin had spent years bribing Qi's chancellor, a man named Hu Sheng, persuading him to keep Qi neutral while every other kingdom fell, one after another, around it. Qi's rulers, trusting their chancellor's counsel, refused to send aid to Han, Zhao, Wei, Yan, or Chu as each one was destroyed in turn. Most people never imagine that an entire kingdom could talk itself out of saving its neighbors and, in doing so, talk itself out of saving its own future. By 221 before the Common Era, Qi was the only state left standing, and its leaders only then began scrambling to fortify their western border, the direction from which they assumed an attack would come. The Qin general Wang Ben simply went around them. He marched his forces south through the recently conquered territory of Yan and approached Qi's heartland from an unguarded direction entirely, encountering almost no resistance as he advanced. When Qin forces arrived at the gates of Linxi, Qi's capital and one of the great cities of the ancient world, King Jian, on the advice of the same chancellor who had been quietly working against him for years, surrendered without a single battle being fought. The proud kingdom that had hosted the most celebrated intellectual community in the ancient Chinese world ended not in fire or flood, but in silence. Its gates simply opened. King Guan was exiled to a remote location called Gong, where, according to the historical record, he eventually died of starvation. A quiet and almost unbearably bleak final chapter for a man whose kingdom had once seemed too wealthy and too distant to ever fall. 6 kingdoms. 6 different endings. A capital filed away into paperwork. A city weakened by famine and earthquake before a single soldier arrived. A city drowned by an engineered flood that killed more civilians than any battlefield. A failed assassination that accelerated the very disaster it was meant to prevent. A grinding war of attrition across a vast southern territory that eroded a kingdom one province at a time. And a final surrender so quiet that the last independent state in the warring world disappeared without a clash of arms. What disappeared in each case was never simply a government or a ruling family. It was a way of organizing a person's entire sense of belonging. The invisible architecture that told someone which laws applied to them, which language their officials spoke, which gods their public rituals honored, and which ancestors their community remembered together. What was gained, depending entirely on where you stood, was either the end of 2 centuries of relentless warfare between rival kingdoms, or the beginning of a single centralized authority unlike anything the region had experienced before. Both of those things were true at the same time, which is part of why this period remains so difficult to render as a simple story of villains and victims. History remembers the year 221 before the Common Era as the moment Qin's king declared himself Shi Huangdi, the first emperor. The moment 7 warring kingdoms became one continuous territory for the first time in living memory. But the people who actually lived through Han's silent absorption, through Zhao's earthquake and famine, and betrayed general, through Wei's drowned capital, through Yan's failed dagger and burning farewell song at the Yi River, through Chu's slow erosion across a generation, and through Qi's gates opening without a fight, did not experience unification as a single triumphant date on a calendar. They experienced it as 6 separate endings of 6 separate worlds, each one arriving in its own particular and irreversible way, each one changing forever what it meant to wake up that morning in a place that, by nightfall, no longer existed in the way it always had. The people who lived through this never knew they were creating history. They only knew their world was changing, kingdom by kingdom, river by river, gate by gate, until there was only one ruler left to declare what came next. And if these were the last days before China became one empire, the next question is even stranger. What happened to the millions of people who woke up the following morning, no longer subjects of Han or Zhao or Wei or Yan or Chu or Qi, but suddenly, and for the first time in their lives, simply subjects of something called an empire? What did it actually feel like to live inside the very first days of a unified China, when the laws, the writing, the coins in your pocket, and even the width of the road outside your door were all about to change at once?